The hearing will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on Fueling American Innovation and Recovery, Federal Role in Research and Development. I want to welcome our witnesses who are here with us today. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time to address technical difficulties that may arise with such remote proceedings. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, we're holding this hearing virtually in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965. First, consistent with the regulations, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when they are recognized for their 5 minutes. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute you under any other conditions. Second, members must have their cameras on throughout this proceeding and must be visible on screen in order to be recognized. As a reminder, members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. Finally, to maintain safety in light of the attending physician's new guidance, any members present in the hearing room must wear a mask at all times when they are not speaking. For those members not wanting to wear a mask, the House rules provide a way to participate remotely from your office without being physically present in the hearing room. Now, I'm proud to introduce our witnesses. This afternoon, we will be hearing from Dr. Sudip Parikh, CEO at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dr. Paul Romer, a professor in economics at New York University, the Honorable Deborah Wince-Smith, President and CEO at the Council on Competitiveness, and Dr. Willie Shih, Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. Since our last hearing, there have been more than 600,000 new confirmed coronavirus cases, and more than 9,000 Americans have succumbed to the virus. Our economy is in free fall, and unemployment is forecast to remain in the double digits for the foreseeable future. Across the country, men, women, and children are still marching and advocating for a more just and peaceful future. While the state of our union remains uncertain, there is hope, and there are answers yet to be discovered. Reinvigorating our science and engineering capabilities can help our nation address the crises we face today, while better preparing our nation for the future. But despite its immense potential and history of success, the federal commitment to research and development has declined, while this administration systematically suppresses, distorts, ignores, or thwarts scientific research in the name of false hope. Last year, non-defense discretionary funding as a percent of GDP equaled its lowest level in 50 years, and government support for science and engineering has been one of the casualties. Federal R&D funding as a share of the economy has fallen from barely 1.9% in the mid-1960s to less than 0.7% in 2018, hindering advancements and slowing innovation. Not surprisingly, we are increasingly outranked by global competitors like China on international benchmarks of competitiveness. Now, COVID-related disruptions and the administration's failure to take this health threat seriously threaten to further derail U.S. innovation. Meanwhile, other nations are working to solve both the global health and economic crises by ramping up investments in R&D, spurring their recovery while planning for future advancements that will help them maintain their competitive edge in the global market. Experts have stressed the importance of aggressive, responsible, and strategic investments to our recovery from COVID-19 and the economic fallout. Aside from the obvious, like developing vaccines and treatments for COVID-19, federal R&D investments would also help spur an inclusive recovery, boost regional economies, and put Americans back to work. Targeting federal investments to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the research and innovation ecosystem would allow us to fully tap into talents of all our citizens and would accelerate discovery while also increasing GDP per capita by as much as 3 to 4%. Localized clusters of federally supported R&D in labs and universities can increase regional economic opportunities, creating jobs in the short and long term. We have seen this work before. Evidence indicates that Recovery Act stimulus investments in R&D had a large and positive employment effect. This investment would attract, not displace, additional private investment, while creating new opportunities across the country and fueling revolutionary solutions to pressing problems. It could spur entirely new industries that many established companies find too risky or cost prohibitive to explore. Recognizing the value of federal investments, Congress has begun the work to restore R&D funding. Bipartisan budget agreement of 2019 added significantly to both defense and non-defense discretionary funds that would otherwise have been at austerity levels. And Congress has appropriated additional supplemental resources
for the hurricane, which has had a lot of attention recently. We're working with
the coronavirus pandemic. But Congress needs a committed partner in the White House to ensure scientific evidence, data, and research are once again incorporated meaningfully into federal policy. Instead, the Trump administration has routinely sabotaged the work of federal scientists and experts, prioritized politics over progress, buried data, purposefully misled the public on issues ranging from climate change to the impact of chemical exposure on our children's health. And now this disdain for science has made America a global hotspot for coronavirus infection. Shouldn't take a lawsuit for this administration to release data on the racial disparities of coronavirus infections. Scientists and experts should never be muzzled and prevented from sharing potentially life-saving information with the public. The American people are being forced to withstand the tragic results of the administration's devotion to ignorance in favor of political points and division. From putting a man on the moon and the invention of the internet to groundbreaking medical advancements, federal investments in R&D have fueled our economic growth, helped us tackle problems home and abroad, and made America a beacon of innovation and discovery. Without a renewed commitment to science and innovation, we risk squandering our recovery and the opportunity to move our nation forward as a global force for good. We will not be able to defeat the virus and foster an inclusive recovery if our communities don't have the tools, knowledge, and freedom to do it. That will take investment and an administration that respects science and facts. I look forward to this important discussion, and I am eager to hear from our witnesses. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Womack, to unmute his microphone and give his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses who are joining us today. Our nation's strong innovation ecosystem has always been driven by the pioneering spirit on which America was founded. Throughout the centuries, we have leveraged research and development to make unthinkable progress across industries and drive the United States, indeed the world, forward. This has enabled our economic competitiveness in many of the country's public missions: national security, healthcare, infectious disease response, rural development, disaster preparedness and response, and a whole lot more. Thanks to R&D, advancements that could only once be imagined are now possible. Whether it's developing the vaccine for COVID-19, next-generation computers and phones, carbon capture and storage, or the next stealth multi-role combat aircraft fighter. The delivery of these capabilities has been rooted in the ability to unleash innovation, research, and technology. I saw an example of this firsthand this week as I visited a company in my own district, Now Diagnostics in Springdale, Arkansas. They developed simple diagnostic tests, which require nothing more than a drop of blood and a few minutes to yield results. Their products cover everything from a COVID-19 antibody test to screenings for malaria and Ebola. Just one example of the many American companies producing cutting-edge technology and solutions. So how do we continue to encourage these types of breakthroughs? Washington should support private industry, which has led a vast majority of investment, and promote policies that encourage companies to continue to unleash opportunity in this critical space. This supporting role of the federal government should focus on resources for R&D in areas such as early-stage research and streamlining regulations. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, I've advocated for federal research funding for critical NIH programs, including Alzheimer's, ALS, diabetes, and pediatric cancer research. We also can't overlook national security priorities like the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, which helps us combat bioterrorism and other emerging health threats. It's for these programs that I will continue to voice my concern for the true challenge that threatens all critical federal programs, including R&D initiatives. That is our out-of-control deficit and debt. We're spiraling toward a fiscal crisis. Once we get there, once it hits, there will be zero money to fund these critical programs. I've said over and over again as an appropriator, one of my chief concerns is that we continue to have major food fights in appropriations on the House floor about how we fund the discretionary side of the budget. There won't be any money for R&D if we don't tackle the real problems facing our country, and that's on mandatory spending. It's grown from 34% of the federal budget in 1965 to 70% today. It's projected to grow to 76% in 2030. Discretionary spending, which includes funding for health research, space exploration, and the National Science Foundation, has declined from 66% of the federal budget in 1965 to just 30% today. It is literally being squeezed away. What this committee should be focusing on is putting together a budget that addresses out-of-control mandatory spending, the driver of our unsustainable deficits and debt. If policymakers want to prioritize R&D funding, they must first tackle this threat. It's not easy. It's going to require political courage. Indeed, some members will go home as a result. Congress must get back to making the tough choices. It won't be an easy job, but it has to be done. This is the only way critical federal programs, both discretionary and mandatory, will continue to exist for current and future generations. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I'll take just a quick moment of personal privilege to say that on the subject of R&D, my good friend Joe Steinmetz, the chancellor at the University of Arkansas, has made research an important cornerstone of his administration at the U of A in Fayetteville, our land-grant university. I expect within the next several days there will be a major announcement of a funding source for a major research institute on our very own campus in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I look forward to sharing that news with you at the appropriate time. Mr. Chairman, as always, thank you for your leadership. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Womack, for your opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, they may submit those statements electronically to the clerk for the record. And once again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written testimony, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to present your oral remarks. As a reminder, please unmute your microphone before speaking. Dr. Parikh, please unmute your microphone and begin when you are ready.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. I am Sudip Parikh, and I have the privilege of being the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and also the publisher of the Science family of journals. Our mission is to advance science, engineering, and innovation for the benefit of all people, or to put it more simply, to advance science and serve society. Today, I want to briefly discuss 3 reasons why I think today's hearing is incredibly timely, and then provide 3 recommendations to the committee, to the Budget Committee. First, science and engineering are more important now than ever in our national preparation and response to current crises, including COVID-19, but also ongoing challenges such as climate change and economic competitiveness. In response to these crises, the federal government has a vital leadership and coordination role that can be the difference between success and failure. Successfully preparing for and responding to COVID-19, climate change, and threats to competitiveness will require the federal government to play the role of a quarterback. Second, science has a substantive role to play in advancing shared opportunity and fair treatment for everyone by addressing challenges in the scientific enterprise and providing an evidence base for national policymaking. Science and evidence must be integrated into the policymaking process to advance shared opportunity and fair treatment for all. Science, especially social science, is key to unlocking our path forward. The work of scientists is critical to better understanding and interpreting data on government spending on incarceration, officer-involved shootings, crime reduction, health disparities, and other relevant topics. To be able to address national policymaking issues, science must also look inward to ensure that the scientific enterprise is addressing our own biases. The core of our nation's innovation ecosystem is more than just funding for research. It is also the investment we make in people. Third, it's time to increase our investments and update our federal policy and investment framework to continue harnessing the scientific research that builds the U.S. economy and increases the safety and well-being of all Americans. Right now, our nation is celebrating the 75th anniversary of Science, the Endless Frontier, written by Vannevar Bush in 1945. That provided a policy framework that envisioned a national partnership between government, academia, and industry to harness basic scientific knowledge for security and well-being. That framework has served as the basis for our investment in advancing basic research into industrial innovation and economic success. But frankly, it's time for an update. The scientific enterprise has evolved far beyond Bush's original vision and now delivers scientific advances, medical cures, innovative technology products, raised standards of living, economic growth, and frankly, awe-inspiring understanding of the universe. That scientific ecosystem is nourished by broad and varied federal investment in research and development, university and nonprofits, institute-based scientists driving thought leadership, innovative financial instruments to bring private sector risk capital, entrepreneurs who are driven to move scientific advances from the lab to the consumer, industry investment, particularly in development, and agile regulatory agencies able to keep up with the progress of science and technology and factor it into their decision-making. Each piece of that ecosystem is important, but it all begins with the federal role. Our global competitors have seen our success and are paying it the highest compliment. They're copying it. The 2020 State of U.S. Science and Engineering Report shows that although the U.S. spent more on R&D than any other country in 2017, other nations are catching up. And since 2000, the American share of global R&D has declined from 37 to 25%. As U.S. research intensity, or R&D as a share of GDP, is well below its peak level and below the investment levels of 9 other countries. How much should we invest? Well, as Chairman Yarmuth pointed out, federal funding for research and development peaked at 1.9% of GDP. We should be investing more than we are right now in order to compete with other nations in science, technology, and innovation. There are many ways to look at this, and I provide additional details in my written testimony. And this takes us to my recommendations. The U.S. should update the Bush framework for advancing science and serving society with an emphasis on full spectrum innovation, including fundamental science, mission-driven technology, and useful knowledge programs that meet local, national, and international needs, with the federal government as a key partner. The United States should increase total investment in R&D as a percentage of GDP to 1.9%, which would require increases of approximately 11% per year. This would match the peak we achieved more than 5 decades ago and put us firmly back into the top 3 countries for research intensity globally by 2035. And lastly, scientific leaders must ensure that the scientific enterprise is supporting opportunities for all by addressing challenges within the scientific enterprise and providing the evidence base to inform national policymaking. This is just critical to ensuring a fairer scientific enterprise and a fairer world. Thank you for having me today, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Romer for 5 minutes. So please unmute your mic, Dr. Romer.
Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for giving me this chance to contribute to this discussion about how to fuel innovation and recovery, and to contribute by summarizing the lessons I've learned from my analysis of long-run economic growth. We share 2 ambitions. We want the United States to be the leading nation in basic scientific research. We also want it to be the leading nation in the delivery of the technological progress that lifts the productivity of our workforce and raises standards of living for our citizens. The main message I want to convey today is that it takes different types of investment to achieve these 2 ambitions. As a result, you, the members of Congress, face a trade-off. When you contemplate additional investment in our future, you can choose to invest in basic science or in technological progress. The secondary message that I want to convey is that, in my opinion, in recent decades, the nation has underinvested in technological progress. In particular, we have allowed the strengths that we built up prior to World War II to depreciate. So as a result, the investments you could make now that would yield the highest payoffs would be investments in the kinds of measures that delivered such remarkable technological progress before World War II. if I could ask for the first of my slides to be displayed. This 2x2 table suggests that the nations can be either leaders or followers in basic scientific achievement or in technological progress. And a nation can be a leader in one or the other or both. If I could have the second slide. The narrative that is often told about the United States is that we were in a position of leadership along both dimensions after World War II, but because of changes in the environment, changes in the economy, other changes, we are no longer as good at delivering technological progress. In the language that Deborah Winch-Smith will use, we generate ideas, but they don't cross the valley of death into the realm where they deliver practical benefit. If I could have the next slide. The story I want to tell of our history is slightly different. We started out as a nation as a follower in both science and in technology, but because of the Morrill Act and our investment in the land-grant institutions, including the institution that Ranking Member Wormack mentioned in Arkansas. Because of our investment in the land-grant universities, we moved into a position of technological dominance prior to World War II. Then after World War II, we achieved a huge transformation where we became the world's leading producer of basic scientific research. But this was a new endeavor for us. We were not a nation that produced Nobel Prize quality research before World War II. And unfortunately, in this transition, we lost the strengths. We didn't continue to invest in the strengths of our system that existed before. Now, the extent of the problem that this leaves us with, whether you believe in the first narrative or this second one, was brought home to me by a conversation with Carrie Stephenson, who's the founder of Decode Genetics, the company that's doing population scale genetics in Iceland, and which was the leader in its testing program to combat the pandemic. Carrie said to me that, Paul, all of the insights, all of the science that we rely on and every country in the world relies on was developed in US universities. But why is it that your nation is not taking the same advantage of those developments? This suggests that our problem with technology and transfer of knowledge is not exclusively one that exists in the business sector. We see it in the government sector as well. And we need to invest in the mechanisms that once worked, that made us a powerhouse in technological progress and could do so again. Thank you.
Thank you. I didn't unmute. I now recognize the Honorable Winch-Smith for 5 minutes. Please unmute your mic and proceed.
Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I have the privilege of representing the Council on Competitiveness, a nonpartisan leadership organization of CEOs, university presidents, labor leaders, and national laboratory directors, all committed to advancing U.S. competitiveness in the global economy and raising the standard of living for all Americans through increases in productivity and economic growth. Since 1986, the Council has championed the federal role in innovation and advocated for measures that could generate greater returns to the nation from its public investments in research and development, in people, and in infrastructure. As we've heard, for 75 years, the federal government has fulfilled the vision articulated in Vannevar Bush's seminal report, Science, the Endless Frontier, sowing seeds for the innovation and technology-driven productivity gains that propelled our country to global economic leadership, generated unprecedented wealth for Americans, drove social progress, and ensured our national security. However, 2 decades into the 21st century, the global environment for leveraging science and technology for inclusive economic gain, social benefit, and national security has fundamentally changed, and our nation needs a new game plan. First, we compete in a multipolar science and technology world. In 1960, the U.S. dominated technology to the size of our investment. 69% of global R&D, the U.S. share has dropped to 28%, and China's has risen to 26%. Second, great revolutions in science and technology, such as biotech, AI, and nanotechnology, coupled to the new phase of the digital revolution, are colliding and converging simultaneously. These technologies are reshaping the global economy, society, and all dimensions of our lives as we speak. They will disrupt industries, markets, and jobs, and they pose profound implications for our country's economic prowess and national security capabilities. Third, China has set its sight on world leadership in these technologies. It has launched a full force, richly funded, licit and illicit campaign to achieve this goal, pursuing aggressive plans to dominate every single strategic critical technology at the heart of President Xi's civil-military fusion imperative. In response, the Council on Competitiveness has convened a multi-year National Commission on Innovation and Competitive Frontiers comprising more than 60 CEOs, university presidents, labor leaders, and national laboratories, led by our distinguished board of directors. Over the past few months, this commission community has deliberated and identified 9 priorities that the commission will initially address, 5 of which are directly linked to the federal role in research and development. 1, our economic and military leadership depend on securing capabilities in these strategic critical technologies. This includes preserving and leveraging, in partnership with industry, the world-class assets of our universities, our national laboratories, and ensuring our entrepreneurial emerging companies can move from startup to scale up, all part of this national innovation ecosystem. And we must also launch a new era of strategic partnerships with trusted allies around the globe. The federal investment in R&D as a percentage of gross domestic product has been on steady decline, and we have already all spoke about this. So I ask you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, is this a new Sputnik moment? 2, we must strengthen U.S. resiliency. The COVID-19 crisis and virus economy has exposed key weaknesses, such as fragile supply chains that focus more on cost and efficiency and not on resiliency and security. And we have a lack of control over the production and distribution of items critical to the health and security of our citizens. We must harness advanced technologies from digital systems to drones to make every level of our society and systems more resilient, more adaptive, and more cyber secure. 3, the proverbial valley of death continues to be a major bottleneck in the U.S. innovation system and a barrier to accelerating the rate and scope of U.S. innovation, as it prevents many innovations, as I've said, from startup to scale up. Many never reach the marketplace. They're vulnerable to foreign acquisition and bankruptcy. China is shopping now with an unlimited checkbook for valuable IP, know-how, and people. 4, we must amplify university and national lab technology transfer, commercialization, and industrial engagements, and to move beyond bureaucratic barriers, ensure that missions and cultures align with this imperative. And 5, too many citizens and communities are disconnected from the nation's innovation enterprise, with just 10 states accounting for 2/3 of R&D spending, U.S. high-tech hubs just on the coast, and we need to see a diversity of venture capital funding, as well as ensuring that women and minorities engage in the system. I look forward, Mr. Chairman and committee, for your questions and to sharing the results of the first stage of our innovation imperative when we release this in December this year.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Xi. 5 minutes. Please unmute your mic and proceed.
Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. Though I teach at the Harvard Business School, I'm actually a scientist by training with 2 degrees from MIT and a PhD in chemistry from the University of California, Berkeley. I have been a beneficiary of our country's investments in basic scientific research and engineering post-Sputnik, a time when our heroes were scientists like Jonas Salk or Richard Feynman. I still remember watching the first Telstar transatlantic transmission and the Apollo launches, and I tip my hat to Dr. Parekh. AAAS's Science magazine is still one of my go-to sources. Post-World War II was marked by great public faith in science. After all, science had won the war, and it wasn't just the atom bomb, it was penicillin, antibiotics, radar, digital computer, whole field of operations research, and many more. And investments in basic science research led to unquestioned American leadership for decades. And the spillovers into industry and from industry were spectacular. We remember Bell Labs, IBM Research, Fairchild Semiconductor, RCA Sarnoff, Rockwell Science Center, a host of others. Other countries followed America's lead and invested in basic research because they too understood the linkage to innovation, technological, and economic progress. Chinese investments are particularly impressive, but they have been part of a roadmap laid out in the mid-1980s to develop the capabilities in a modern economy. Funding for basic research, particularly at universities, is all about building capabilities. It's about training future generations of the researchers. As these researchers flow into the industry, they bring those capabilities with them. It's hard to quantify benefits attached to specific lines of research or projects. Rather, it is the ability to recognize future problems and opportunities. In the 1870s, Louis Pasteur thought he was solving problems with fermentation in the French wine industry, but along the way, he invented the modern field of bacteriology. GE Research was initially focused on improving the filaments in light bulbs, but ended up pioneering high vacuum technology and inventing the vacuum tube, which led to the groundwork for radio and television. The pandemic has exposed the value of capabilities in our country. The funding for the Human Genome Program and fundamental life sciences research have built unrivaled capabilities in genomics and biotechnology. The U.S. scientific community has led work on vaccines and therapies for COVID-19. We do this better than any other country in the world, and it's because we made those long-term investments in basic sciences in the preceding decades. But the pandemic has also expressed our nation's reliance on other parts of the world. With this has come the realization we have let our capabilities diffuse away in a wide range of sectors like semiconductors, electronics, machine tools, and countless others. So what should we do now? I see more funding for basic research. I have talked to people on both sides of the aisle who I think agree with that. But let me tell you another story. My late father, when I was growing up, was an economist, and I used to watch him come home from work frustrated, and I told myself, I'm never going to do that. I'm going to go into sciences and engineering, which is, of course, what I did. But you know what? I always ended up working on economic problems because I found out if you didn't get the economics right, it didn't matter how great the science and engineering were, you had to look at the whole picture. Basic research needs stable funding that can have patience for long-term results. Since the majority of federal R&D funding is discretionary spending, it is perennially at risk of getting crowded out by mandatory spending on things like debt service entitlements. When I was in high school and had my sights set on science and engineering, the mandatory portion of the budget was 34%. It's closer to 70% now, as we've heard, and we all know that's not going in the right direction. So for sure, more funding for basic research. At the same time, I would love to see incentives to encourage firms to conduct more research, especially applied and translational research. I see great opportunities in manufacturing process innovations as well, things like continuous flow reactors, biomanufacturing, things that will enable American firms to leapfrog competitors. We could encourage and even fund pre-competitive R&D collaborations where partners work together on a common technology platform with which they intend to independently develop differentiated products downstream, and I included that in my written testimony. Finally, I've been thinking a lot about another issue. Most prescriptions for rebuilding American competitiveness focus on the supply side and sending firms to move production to or back to the U.S. I think we need to focus as well on the demand side, growing domestic demand in early markets for new technologies as a way of incenting the growth of local supply. We saw this in the 60s with DoD and NASA, who bought 60% of all the ICs made, which really helped the American semiconductor industry get started. We've seen this more recently with NASA and DoD funding SpaceX, and that gives them the cash flow to really change the game. Demand provides economic motivation to the manufacturers, and proximity to production extremely valuable. So I think it's also very important for people, because when you have demand in a sector, then it drives students to go there for careers. Basic science research is a core of American global leadership. It's why the best and the brightest want to come here and work here. Let's ensure our continued leadership. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'm happy to take questions.
Okay. Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now begin our question and answer period. As a reminder, members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions, the witnesses' answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members wishing to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them to the clerk electronically within 7 days. Now we begin question and answers. I will defer my questioning until the end. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, the Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I want to thank all the witnesses for testifying, but especially the minority witness, Professor Willie Shih, who spent a full semester asking me questions not that long ago in business school. I only get 5 minutes, but what an honor it is to have those 5 minutes indeed. So thank you, Professor Shih, for being here. And a special thanks to my friend and fellow veteran, the ranking member, Steve Womack, for inviting Mr. Shih, for talking about the important in your opening remarks, and for working to come to bipartisan conclusions about the way forward. And Professor Shih, I will add, thank you for being such a great professor in my first year of business school that I asked you to advise our independent study in my second year. We did a financial analysis of the California high-speed rail program. We came to 2 significant conclusions. One, the project is going to cost a lot more than California says, a conclusion that was borne out soon thereafter when the state raised their cost estimates. And 2, despite the higher costs, it still is a much better investment at lower cost and higher returns than the alternative of expanding airports and highways to meet the transportation demand in the next 50 years. In other words, if you do a cost analysis, the project looks expensive, but if you do a cost comparison, it presents a very different conclusion. And if you do a cost-benefit analysis, as we should be doing in government budgeting, it becomes a no-brainer. Professor Shih, you have often said that investing in rail is smart because rail is so efficient, and we'll get to investing in 21st century infrastructure versus 1950s infrastructure in a minute. But first, I want to amplify Chairman Yarmuth's opening remarks with this graph, which specifically shows that federally funded R&D as a share of the U.S.'s GDP is declining. Sam, please display the second slide in my deck titled Federal R&D as a share of GDP. Here in Massachusetts, where Professor Shih and I both live, we are quite proud of our biotech industry, the pioneers in creating vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. Professor Shih, is there any connection between the success of a company like, say, Moderna and the graph that we see here?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think Moderna is kind of a textbook example, and not only Moderna, but a lot of the other U.S. companies that are actively working on this. What we've seen is a pivot, and what it reflects is the capabilities that have been built up by these very prescient investments in the Human Genome Program going back to the late 80s, early 90s, and the development of this cluster around Massachusetts and New England. Right? So it is directly a consequence of the capability development in people, I should add, people who've been trained as researchers. And then when we had this crisis, those people pivoted from whatever they were doing. Most gratifying thing I've seen in this COVID-19 crisis is scientists, anybody who is anywhere close to viral infection and vaccines or pharmacology or any of the life sciences, we've seen this tremendous pivot. Everybody working on an angle of this disease, and it's because we built those capabilities. It's just like I was talking about with Louis Pasteur, and what kind of capabilities, so you can recognize when problems come up, different ways of responding to them. So I think it's directly linked.
Right, Sam, if you could just switch the display back to me. So Professor Shih, the next thing I'd like you to comment on is whether or not it's a problem for America, a competitive threat to our leadership, that China is investing much more in government funding in biotech than we are here in the United States. And Sam, if you would just please display the third slide in my deck titled high-speed rail by country. This same story that we're showing here about high-speed rail could be told for broadband, green technology, or carbon-free nuclear energy. So, Sam, you can bring the display back to me. But Professor Shi, it seems that we're falling behind across the board, and none of these issues should be partisan. I mean, our conclusions on California high-speed rail were not geared towards a Democratic position or Republican position. They were just math. In fact, I never had any idea about your political proclivities coming into this, Mr. Shi. But could you talk about what future-focused investments in infrastructure do to create a market for domestic manufacturing?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is just as we saw NASA and DoD created demand for integrated circuits in the 1960s, okay? And frankly, that's what got the whole integrated circuit industry, firms like Texas Instruments, off the ground, right? Because it was the demand for that, okay? And I have seen this in China in many areas where what they do is they generate demand for a product, and first of all, what it does is firms sense opportunity, so they go invest in plants and equipment, they invest in R&D. By the way, they compete with each other, okay? But having the demand, bright young people go into because they see career prospects, okay, and so they go into it. One of the things that my recent research on China has really highlighted is it's much less of a top-down command and control type model for innovation as well, okay? Because what you see is, Beijing may set some directions. I mentioned they set this, science and technology leadership policy back in 1986. It was called the 863 program because it was established in March of 1986. That's when they laid out this roadmap for capability development. But then you have regions and provinces and cities who say, okay, government says this, we're going to go invest in these areas, and they compete with each other. Okay, so it has much more market quality than a lot of people would recognize in terms of the results they produce. You get a lot of waste, but we see the results in terms of what they have done. The high-speed rail investment in China is a really interesting example. They have used it as much because they want it for transportation, to modernize transportation. It's actually a tool for economic development. Okay, I happened to visit the world's most advanced flat panel factory in Hefei, China 2 years ago, and I took the high-speed rail over from Shanghai, and I asked them, why is this factory here? Okay, now that's a much longer story, but the fact that you had high-speed rail meant the engineers were commuting from Beijing or commuting from Shanghai, right? And so there's also an economic development aspect of this. So it's an interesting combination of things which has led to their leadership, but it's very much driven by this demand side.
Great, thank you very much.
Appreciate that. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, for 10 minutes.
And I thank the chairman again for hosting this all-important discussion about research and development, particularly in the pandemic phenomenon where we find ourselves today. Real quickly, Dr. Shi, you had mentioned in your remarks and picked up on the fact that I gave a lot of attention in my opening remarks to the fact that the deficits and the debt are becoming a chronic problem in our country. And I spoke specifically about the fact of what I call this big squeeze, the fact that the mandatory side of our balance sheet is continuously squeezing that discretionary side, where most of this research and development funding, the lion's share of it, comes from. And so if you just kind of project this thing out a few more years, and if indeed we don't find a solution for throttling back the growth of the mandatory programs, this situation is not going to get better. Indeed, it is going to get a lot worse. Would you agree?
Well, that's why I made that comment. Now, this is not a political persuasion statement. This is just kind of like how I grew up. Like, I don't like to borrow money and stuff like that. Okay, but set that aside. When I was in business, I found that this problem is essentially the fixed cost, variable cost part of your budgeting process. Okay, and what happens is when times get tight, everybody cuts all the variable costs because those are the things they can do. Okay, but in essence, what you do is you mortgage your future when you do that. Right. So, I understand the importance of the mandatories. Okay. But, we look at where this trend is going, and, I'm relying on our leaders, you guys, to be thoughtful about how do we manage this problem, right? Because we can project where it goes, and the money has to come from somewhere.
So I want to go to Ms. Wynn Smith for just a moment on the same subject. It just is inescapable to me that if you're not able, it's one thing to defer the maintenance of a road. With increased cost of asphalt, concrete, this sort of thing, labor, if you defer it, it's probably going to become more expensive. But can you talk from the area on the Council of Competitiveness, delays or deferral of investing in key research? It's not the same as just deferring maintenance on a piece of infrastructure, is it not?
Absolutely not. And let me just say that in terms of where our investment needs to be in research and development, the basic research has been tremendously important. It will continue to be. It's given us the seed core for the future. But we do have to ramp up in a major way our investments in these platform critical technologies that I talked about in my opening statement. So let me give you an example. We can do a lot of basic research in next generation microelectronics as we reach the end of Moore's Law. But if we don't have a capability to bring together the industrial infrastructure, the suppliers, the ecosystem, and to manufacture at scale here in the United States, we will risk the underpinning for basically the future economy to China. It's a huge issue. We did this very strategically. Back when Sematech was created, it had DoD investment matched with private sector, and it changed the game. But we also linked that investment to enforcing our trade laws with Japan and having a regulatory system that also unleashed private sector capital. So what I'd like to say here is we have to connect the pieces we have. That's part of the new game plan. We can't just rely on individual investigators and universities. We can't just rely on missions in the national labs, startup companies, and big companies now who aren't investing in research. We've got to put all this together in a very strategic way. And the federal government has a huge leadership role to play in setting this strategy in partnership with the private sector. So if I were asked, what is the one thing we cannot afford to lose going forward? It's the leadership in not just the research, but in the manufacturing at scale here in the United States of the next generation microelectronics.
So one other question for you, and that is, what is the council's idea or position or thought on demand for on the talent demand? I mean, if you're not investing the kind of research and development that we all know that we need to be doing, what does that say to the future scientists and engineers that are coming through that pipeline right now about their future career choices?
We have to invest in the development of the talent. We have to invest in it starting, in the K through 12, all the way up to the highest end of the research enterprise. And we also have to make this far more inclusive. We need to use all of our people in a way that they can contribute to this innovation ecosystem. So it's very concerning. I mean, I'm a woman, of course. It's very concerning that still, after many years and many programs, we don't see women in the leadership roles in the science and technology enterprise. And of course, we have, racial issues as well in underrepresentation. So that's a huge issue, and we have to invest. Our departments and science agencies need to invest. One place where I will say it's being done very, very well is in the military. And I have the fortune to have two sons who came out of the Naval Academy, and I witnessed firsthand how they mentored and developed talent representing our demographics, and did it in a way that virtually all of the midshipmen and women graduate with full engineering degrees, and they make sure that happens. We have to do that throughout our country now, and it has to be a very high priority, because without the people, we don't have anything to move forward with.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Shi, back to you for just a minute. It goes without saying that research and development and manufacturing kind of go hand in hand. And we've seen this in a kind of a unfortunate sort of way during the COVID-19 phenomenon with the ability to produce ventilators, N95 masks, that whole broad range of PPE, basic stuff that you should be prepared to have or be able to create in an emergency that we've not been able to. Why does a country with such vast resources, such great talent, such amazing innovation struggle to keep the innovation side and the manufacturing side on the same side?
I think it traces back to demand, and in particular for PPE and ventilators and things like that, stable demand. Okay, and what we ended up having is a lot of commoditization pressure from low-cost suppliers in China in particular. Okay, and I was just talking to an Indian pharmaceutical company because I'm looking at the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. That was exposed during this pandemic as well. And they said, well, we used to be vertically integrated, but then we had the emergence of all these Chinese suppliers who had much lower costs. And if you don't buy your active pharmaceutical ingredients from them, you are not competitive. So they just got squeezed out from that. We see that, for example, in steel. I never understood why steel could cost 60% as much to manufacture in China, or the FOB factory price for steel in China could be 60% of what it is in the U.S. when you're buying iron ore at world market prices and coking coal at world market prices and energy at world market prices. Okay, but sometimes they have subsidies. But then the consequence of that, for example, is if you want to buy a steel shipping container, there are only 2 manufacturers left in the world, and they're both in China. Okay, and it's a consequence of those kind of platform things, which, because they're cost driven and people won't pay a premium for assured supply, we don't have them in the U.S. Okay, so I would say, we had PPE makers in the U.S., and if we gave them stable demand contracts, that's fine. They'd still be around. Okay, but we penalize companies if they have underutilized capacity or they're higher cost. Right, so it's very hard from a business standpoint to stay in those businesses.
Yeah. Chairman, again, thank you for bringing such an interesting panel, a very qualified panel to our Budget Committee today. And I'm going to yield back the balance of my time and head pretty soon to a defense markup. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. I thank the ranking member. His time has expired, and I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank all the witnesses. Enjoyed listening as well as before this reading your written testimony. Just a quick plug. 2 speakers before talked about the investments in high-speed rail. Given that I represent Philadelphia, that sits smack dab in the middle of the Northeast Corridor, and am a frequent user of Amtrak myself, I want to echo any investments that we could make in the United States to go toward high-speed rail, and finally join our competitors in Europe and Asia in an area where we greatly lack. I can tell you how important it is here locally to our economy, so much so that during my time in Congress, it was always an issue that brought together members of Congress from both the city as well as the suburbs, Democratic and Republican colleagues. But what I wanted to focus on was manufacturing. And one of the misperceptions about our economy and manufacturing is the notion that caught on in recent decades that America doesn't make anything anymore, and that we had to choose essentially this false dichotomy between continuing to be a high GDP country on the one hand and making things on the other. Germany completely proves that fallacy. Manufacturing makes up a relatively high percentage of that nation's GDP, much higher indeed than ours. I also personally just can't stand the notion that some people have about manufacturing, and they seem to picture a 19th century or early 20th century factory floor. anytime I'm touring a company locally that's involved in manufacturing, I'm always blown away by the technology that is often used in what is considered quote unquote blue collar work. So it's pretty clear to me, self-evident, just even through those tours, the link between research and development and innovation on the one hand and the present as well as the future of manufacturing. So for Ms. Wynne-Smith or Professor Shi, I was wondering if you could speak to that about the link between the investments that we make in R&D and how we can see that that product in terms of manufacturing here in the United States domestically.
Thank you, Congressman. Well, let me just start by saying that in my career, some 25 years ago, I worked on the whole imperative for U.S. leadership in manufacturing. And this is when the Japanese were basically in a fierce trade war with the U.S. on many high tech. And I remember one of the Japanese leaders from MIDI coming and saying, you know, we're worried about manufacturing. It's not dirty, dumb, dangerous, and disappearing. 25 years later, the Council on Competitiveness has articulated in much work that manufacturing is smart, safe, sustainable, and it's surging. And if we don't link the innovation with the manufacturer, we will lose the next generation of innovation. So I have to share the example of flat panel displays. Professor Shi mentioned that factory in China. When I was Assistant Secretary of Commerce, we had invented in the United States, including a path from Kodak, every single flat panel display technology, from liquid crystals, planar, field emitters, the whole thing. We had a plethora of startup companies, and none of them were able to manufacture once they had to build up a factory at scale because of our capital cost structure. And this is why we have to bring these issues into this discussion. We have to have long-term patient capital that is going to go into scale up of manufacturing. A123 batteries is a perfect example. Lots of federal investment, major research, ended up in bankruptcy, and for just a few $1 million bid over Johnson Control, China got all the intellectual property, the people, everything, lock, stock, and barrel, it's in China. So one thing I do want to suggest as a potential major initiative for the country, I'm sure it will be part of the Council's National Innovation Strategy, we do need a national infrastructure bank. We do need to have a different financing path going forward. Today, a venture capitalist firm would never invest in Intel. They won't invest in the deep science manufacturing of the future. And so this is an issue where we have to work on financing, we have to work on tax incentives. Just one last little factoid. We have trillions of dollars sitting in hedge funds in Greenwich, Connecticut. They're not investing in any of the things we're talking about here. But we could create incentives, new capital gains, holdings, all sorts of things to unleash that capital to invest in all the things that we're talking about in this hearing. And if we don't, I think we're giving away, you know, our future and standard of living to our next generation.
Thank you.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired, and now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding the hearing. We could do an entire hearing just on what Deborah Wynne-Smith raised regarding the vulnerability of IP to foreign acquisition. So much to unpack in here, and I'm grateful to you for doing it. First, Mr. Shi, I want to thank you for the years of investment you put into Mr. Moulton. We are all the beneficiaries of your toiling in that vineyard. And I thank you for doing the best you could with what you had to work with in that environment. America thanks you for that. Dr. Romer, I wanted to go first to your chart about basic science versus technological progress. It's not lost on me that almost every quote in your various testimonies today on what percent of GDP was going to R&D was different. We categorize these things in different ways, but you clearly are expressing a need to see us move from basic science preeminence back into technological progress preeminence as well. Does that involve simply additional dollars, as everyone has talked about, or does that also involve reprioritizing the dollars that are going out the door from the federal government today?
So I think a good place to start here is to look back at what worked in the past. So what made us a worldwide power in petrochemicals? It was universities who created chemical engineering as entirely new field of study, new schools, a new type of graduate degree. And it was the people produced by universities who then went out and made us a powerhouse. So I'm echoing something that Dr. Shi said, which is that what really matters here are people. And we've forgotten this. We tend to think of the government's role as to fund papers or patents, and that's what universities produce. But in the past, where the universities were singularly effective in contributing to technological progress was when we rewarded them for producing people who could then go out and raise standards of living, be more productive workers. One way to recover this would be to go back to what worked in the National Defense Education Act and have funds that are directly allocated to students to pursue courses of graduate education. And to go one step further and to say the students are the ones who decide what course of study they will pursue. Unfortunately, the money that we have has been basically captured by professors doing basic research. So all the support for graduate students goes to professors who hire research assistants and support graduate students through their grants, but to work on the things the professors want to work on. And it means that our system doesn't respond when a bunch of young people see an opportunity that they'd like to get trained in and like to go work on. So I think it's not just more money, but it's spending it in different ways, and in particular, betting on and counting on students, and also not relying on the same degree of centralization at the federal level. Go back to what worked before, which was to count on the competition between 50 universities in 50 states that were all competing to do a better job.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Dr. Parikh has a chart or a graph in his presentation that looks at investment in basic science. And while the government investment over the last 40 years has fallen in half, industry investment has doubled. And so as a percent of GDP across our nation, unlike a centralized economy like China, we are still expanding. We're just expanding in different ways. Dr. Parikh, when you included that chart, are those things created equal? Do we get more of the focus that Dr. Romer was talking about on people and applied sciences when the industry is making those investments? Help me to understand whether that's good news or bad news as you laid it out.
Yeah, it's good news and bad news. The good news is that the industry is very good at development. And when it sees an opportunity to go from a discovery to a product, it does a very good job of finding capital and getting there. The challenge becomes that people part. There is not as much development of people whenever the development funding is coming from industry. Those people are created in academia. They're created in these graduate programs, and they are the biggest asset. It's going to take people from everywhere to get cures for COVID, to get cures for cancers, and when we are limited to just development, it breeds just a certain type of person, whether it's the engineer in that one lane or it's the molecular biologist who knows just that one area. It doesn't give us the breadth of backgrounds that really create the innovation and the amazing advances that we see.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the hearing. I yield back.
I appreciate that. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for a very interesting and productive hearing. I want to maybe start with Dr. Parikh, but ask any of you to chime in who wish to. My broad topic, probably what I would have asked before this week, would still involve questions of personnel, the flow of students and postdocs and research fellows from all over the world, the intersection of immigration policy and and the research enterprise in this country. But because it's occurring when it does, this has the feel of another national crisis, and certainly a political controversy. I know I've heard from every institution of higher education in my district, research institutions, who are in a near panic over this apparently the intention of the Trump administration to not let the immigrant students and researchers stay here, whose universities this fall go to completely or have to stick completely with online education, which of course is a big unknown, and certainly throws a lot of questions into how they're going to be able to operate, and not just what the fate of the students is, but what also the universities are to do about this. So I want to ask you about that incident, this problem in particular, and of course it is in the context of a larger question about how immigration policy and the research enterprise, the vitality of the research enterprise in this country intersect. I come, as some of you may know, from a very research-rich environment in North Carolina, the Research Triangle area. Higher education and research are our stock in trade, and along with that, we have a very diverse and impressive immigrant population, people who come in for training and research efforts, and then many of whom stay. And so this announcement has sent waves of apprehension and as I said, near panic through the higher education community. It seems to me that the decision about opening this fall, this is a very, very difficult decision. I think it's going to be, and as the cases spike, it looks worse. I can't imagine that we're helped by adding this element to the decision to make it more complex. So by adding in the element of what the effect on international students is, and with the effect on international students, the effect of the projects and the enterprises that they're a part of in the university. So I would appreciate your comments on this, the effects that the administration policy would possibly have. I'm sure you're in touch with institutions. You're hearing, just like I am, what the effects might be, and then any broader reflections on the intersection of immigration policy and the research enterprise. I'd be interested in as well. Dr. Parikh, I'd like to start with you, but I'd be happy to hear from all of our witnesses.
Thank you, Congressman. So just to start specifically with the ICE policy announced yesterday, we are very concerned. I'm very concerned. Graduate students from around the world populate our laboratories, and frankly, even though they are students, they are conducting a lot of our research and a lot of our basic research. And so the fact that we are implementing a policy where we might not have them in the laboratory or participating in the research it's bad for America. Second, it's cruel to the students. These are students who might be here already, who might have to go back. It's cruel, and it's just not the right thing to do. To reflect on immigration policy, I am a second-generation American, and I have the privilege of leading the AAAS. My parents came from India to rural North Carolina, Hickory, North Carolina, in 1968. And that is a story that you will hear from thousands of scientists around this country. And as Ronald Reagan said, the United States is the one place where you can come from all over and you can be an American. And the scientists have proven that. And 38% of the Nobel Prizes awarded to Americans since 2000 have gone to immigrants. The population of postdocs in America, that population who are working in artificial intelligence, who are working on biomedical research, who are working on physics, that population is a third immigrants. It's self-defeating to create a policy that doesn't continue the fact that America is a crossroads of science.
If I could just comment on this.
Briefly, if you can, if you will.
Yeah, so, we are dependent on foreign talent to make our university research system run. So if you cut off the supply when you're dependent on a foreign source, you're going to have trouble. But we should step back and ask, why is it that it's not our goal to be fully self-sufficient in talent if need be? We benefit a lot from flows of people across borders, but why are we so short on American talent in our graduate programs? And I think the reality is that we have not made it attractive enough for bright people from the United States to go on in graduate education, and the right kind of fellowship program that puts students in charge in designing and pursuing a graduate career could substantially increase the number of bright U.S. citizens who want to be part of this system.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate you having this hearing today. It's an important topic. You know, as a former chief information officer, I understand the importance of research and development and the critical role that the federal government and the private sector play when it comes to fueling American innovation and economic growth. Thanks to various sectors funding and performing R&D, including the federal government, businesses, state governments, higher education institutions, and nonprofit organizations, the United States has been for a long time a global leader in R&D efforts for decades. And we continue to fund the majority of annual global R&D efforts. In fact, in 2018, the United States spent about $580 billion on R&D, more than any other organization for economic cooperation and development, including China. Two sectors, businesses and the federal government, have together accounted for more than 90% of U.S. R&D funding since 1953. And as we recognize the importance of federal investments in R&D, Congress must do more to remove any barriers that may discourage the private sector from taking the lead on product development. And this COVID-19 pandemic has exposed our nation's reliance on other countries to supply the production of critical supplies like PPE and other things. And it's highlighted the importance of creating products, supply chains, and intellectual capital right here at home. It is time to fully unleash Americans' spirit of innovation, which is why I recently introduced the Advancing Tech Startups Act to promote a national strategy for encouraging more tech-focused startups and small businesses in all parts of the United States, not just out west in Silicon Valley. This legislation would direct the Commerce Department to identify any federal rules or regulations acting as barriers to creation, development, and growth of technology startup companies. You know, America's innovation base starts with R&D, and Congress should continue supporting federal investments in basic research and early stage applied research while simultaneously removing any barriers that may hinder the private sector's role in product development. So, Dr. Shi, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the private sector has been the primary source of funds for R&D in the United States since 1980. Given that the private sector has taken over a growing number of our nation's R&D needs over time, what is the proper role of the federal government, in your view, in research and development?
I think the proper role of the federal government is to fund risky frontier research, which is beyond the capabilities of private firms to necessarily recognize a return. Okay, and that historically, that's why you think of that kind of basic science, basic research as a public good, right? We can, and the country has done this. We've done this in terms of audacious bets. I point to DARPA as a great example of funding audacious bets. You know, today we see the private sector investing a lot in autonomous driving. Well, that was because DARPA did the proof of concept, the risky first steps back in the early 2000s, 10 years before it really became as popular as it is now. So I see the role of the federal government is really that frontier risky stuff where you don't have the guaranteed results.
Okay. Well, let's flip the coin in the other direction then. In your opinion, are there any federal barriers that have hindered or could hinder future R&D efforts? In other words, are there places where it would be better if the federal government stepped aside rather than getting into the mix?
Research and development. Alongside almost all of my colleagues, we voted for 3 COVID-19 relief packages in March that provided approximately $7.5 billion for, quote, the development of necessary countermeasures and vaccines. So we put a lot of money. And I wanted to make the point of who put the money in. Taxpayers have invested heavily in research and development in this fight against COVID-19. And yet, despite this substantial investment and billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars into COVID-19, vaccines, still, we do not have any commitment that they will be affordable and accessible and available to all who need them. And we are already seeing that there is that kind of divide, the kind of price gouging, I would say. When we have Gilead, who produces remdesivir, which is not even a cure, it helps alleviate some of the symptoms, charging per system of, it's like 5 trained, I don't know, it's 5 parts of a treatment, $3,100+ per treatment. Now, who's going to be able to afford that? It's just, I think, unconscionable. And then we saw the government give a $1.6 billion to a company who has never actually, Novavax, produced a drug, and they now have the ability to get $1.6 billion. So my view of this COVID issue is that if we don't make this available to everyone, it's like making it available to no one. Because if it's not available here in this country and to the rest of the world, we are all at risk of continuing forever this virus. We have to make it absolutely accessible. And I've introduced legislation called the MAP Act, HR 7296, that would actually fix that. Along with Representatives Doggett and DeLauro and DeFazio and Rooney, bipartisan. And that bill would prevent price gouging, it would prohibit monopolies, it would ensure transparency on taxpayer-funded drugs. So I want to ask Dr. Parikh, given the necessity of us finding a cure somewhere in the world, I want to ask you, do you believe that we can and should ensure that the beneficiaries, that the benefits of the federal R&D, like life-saving drugs, aren't priced out of reach?
Thank you for the question. I'll start by saying I'm a biochemist, not an economist. But as AAAS, as the American Association for the Advancement of Science, part of our mission is to advance science and serve society. And so the scalability and the accessibility of developments in science is certainly important to us, and we would want to see the public health of the nation, of all people, benefit from our research investment.
And isn't there some danger if everybody doesn't have it accessible, that we could all be still susceptible to the virus?
You certainly would like a vaccine to be as broadly available as possible.
I have 2 seconds, 1 second. I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes. Mr. Flores, is he here? Make sure you're unmuted, Mr. Flores, if you're still on. Well, in that case, if he's on, we'll come back to him. I'll yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett.
All right. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
I hear you, sir.
Right on. Thank you, brother. Thank y'all for allowing me to be here. Is he back on?
Mr. Flores, are you on? Well, we'll come back and get him if he is. Go ahead, Mr. Burchett.
We need to. That's cool, Mr. Chairman. I understand. I am the 435th most powerful person in Congress, so I understand my role as a freshman. Thank you, brother. Everybody knows East Tennessee is home to Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It's the largest of the Department of Energy's 17 national laboratories. Over 2,900 ORNL employees reside in my district that I represent. Of course, they contribute very much to the rich tapestry of our area. And I'm concerned, I guess, more than anything else, and maybe Dr. Parikh or Ms. Wentz-Smith could answer this. Has the overall federal response to the COVID-19 adequately employed the expertise and tools we have at our national laboratories?
Thank you for the question. Oh, go ahead.
I'll jump on that because, first of all, thank you for everything you do to support Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the whole ecosystem of universities and companies that are there. It really is one of our national treasures. I had the opportunity to be there for the dedication of the carbon composite manufacturing facility that's very, very important in our manufacturing infrastructure. I do think that one area where the national labs are playing a huge role, and let's not forget that the whole research that led to the Human Genome Project came out of work at Los Alamos years ago. But one area where they're really leading the way is bringing together their huge state-of-the-art world-class assets in high-performance computing, exascale computing, artificial intelligence, in both, working with the private sector in a new consortium to both understand mitigation, transmutation, all the things that are happening to the virus itself using these computational capabilities. And also, of course, linking that to their tremendous capabilities in materials research. And another lab that's very much involved in this in the pharmaceutical space is Argonne National Lab. So these laboratories have these very powerful user facilities that universities and companies can come and use, and no one, quite frankly, in the world has them on the scale that we do.
Well, but are we utilizing? I appreciate all that. I don't want to run out of time, and I want Dr. Parikh to be able to answer that. Do you think we're utilizing that, though?
I think we can use them more.
Okay. I agree with you, man. And I appreciate Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But you go there, you really should go by Big Ed's Pizza. I just want to leave it at that. And make sure you go there. Doc, thank you so much. We've got a huge Indian community here in Knoxville, in my area, and they're great folks and the longest withstanding democracy in the world, and they make infield motorcycles. So I'm a big fan of India, and a lot of their folks, we laugh about it, but I have a big time when they have India Fest. But go ahead. I want to hear what you had to say too, brother.
Oh, yeah. Look, Oak Ridge National Lab is a national treasure. We could be doing more. Even the material science work going on in terms of making PPE in slightly different ways and making it more quickly is just fantastic work. What it speaks to, though, is that the sciences, they all cross-pollinate. Just because you're working in physics or you're working in material science doesn't mean that you're not involved in healthcare, and vice versa, and the computing as well. So this really speaks to the fact that this linear model of Benever-Bush, it's outdated because all these things mesh together, and they mesh together when we need it in a coordinated way, like with COVID, where we've basically looked at this entire virus over the course of 3 months and know everything about it at the atomic level. All that has changed over the last 20 years. We have to update how we use the national labs and how we use basic research.
What barriers do y'all think that we could better utilize that we eliminate, you think, at our laboratories so we can better get to the answers?
I think you're on mute, Deborah.
So to say their mission really needs to include economic competitiveness and enhance collaboration with industry, in addition to the core national security and energy missions.
And just quickly, getting intellectual property out of the laboratories should be as easy as possible, particularly for things that aren't related to security and national defense.
Okay. Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I see that I've woke up Dan Crenshaw, and I'll anxiously wait for his rebuttal to everything I've said today. So, but thank you. I really miss seeing you guys in real life. I wish this thing would get over for more reasons than one, but I really dig our relationship and our friendship. So thank you.
If we all do that. I thank the gentleman. His time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kilby, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this really important hearing. It comes at an important time. Obviously, we're in a pretty unprecedented moment right now, and it does give us an opportunity, and I think the necessity, to think through the basic elements of our economy and what the future is going to look like. We have the time, and I think the real necessity to think that through. In Michigan, we are the center of the automotive industry. I'm from Flint, which is the birthplace of General Motors. I might have mentioned that I'm from Flint a time or two. But the auto industry is in a transitional phase. And in fact, there's a movement toward electrification. The market is heading in that direction, and we'll benefit from that. We'll benefit in terms of the environmental impact of autos, but we'll also benefit in terms of safety and ultimately in terms of savings for consumers. Right now, China is the #1 manufacturer of electric vehicles in the world. So we have to do more, I believe, to get in front of our competition. I'm a hockey player. I like to go where the puck is going, not chasing it all the time. And I think the market's taking us there. And we need to think about the incentives that we need to put in place in order to win the future when it comes to vehicles, particularly around electric vehicles. My act, the Driving America Forward Act, would expand the electric vehicle tax credit. That's one way to incentivize investment in electric vehicles. And I think it's an important way on the demand side to create some incentives, but it's not all we have to do. The movement toward this technology will require significant new research and development. And I'm particularly concerned that some of the auto manufacturers, the OEMs, are burning a lot of their cash that normally would be devoted to R&D right now just to maintain operations. They're burning their reserves. That's a problem. But I'm wondering, perhaps Dr. Wynn-Smith or Ms. Wynn-Smith, if you might comment on how we can continue to make the investments, given the fact, as you referenced, that China is significantly ramping up, catching us, will pass us in terms of their investment in R&D. How can we continue to lean in, be competitive, invest, given the fact that we respect openness, we respect and embrace collaboration, and the synergy that comes from that, given the fact that China engages in all these practices that we know are destructive and actually, counter-competitive? Is there, their acquisition of trade secrets, all the things that they do? We live in a world of openness. We live in a world where we like to see that synergy. Can you talk a little bit about how we can continue to advance ourselves in terms of the R&D we do in this space, given the fact that culturally we have a different approach?
One thing I think we need to consider in this new game plan for the future is to look at some of the legislation that was very timely when it was passed, but it needs updating. So one, of course, is the research and development tax credits, but also the Cooperative Research and Development Act, which gave some limited relief from collaboration with fear of treble damages and antitrust. And we really need to have more clarity on how, for instance, the U.S. automakers could come together without fear of antitrust actions coming to them to work on collaboratively and pool their resources around the next generation advanced battery technology, because that's really a holy grail for all of this. So that's one thing that I would highly recommend, but also, looking at the tax credit on the research and development. But instead of everybody competing on the battery side, and there is the Advanced Battery Consortium that Argonne Lab and the universities participate in, some of the companies, but I think that needs to be accelerated in a big way. The second thing is really the state regulations, and certainly the Energy Regulatory Commission, state by state, that set a patchwork of regulations, and the extent to which there could be some national imperative to look at the electrification as a national goal and need, back to Dr. Xi's comments about demand, because right now we have a patchwork of state-by-state regulation that acts as a barrier. One thing that's an example from COVID is that we were able to bust through a lot of the regulatory impediments that had inhibited telemedicine. State by state was regulating it, and there was preemption because of the need to have telemedicine. So I think there's a lot that could be done on the tax, fiscal, regulatory environment, but to enable the pulling together of assets among these companies. And another area would be in the critical materials, too, that they need.
Thank you. My time's expired. I really appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. America really is the greatest nation in the world, best equipped to answer the world's challenges. We have the finest institutions, the brightest thinkers, and the structure of our country is set up so private citizens are able to change the world with their innovations. In fact, it's in one of our duties in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the Constitution, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Such an important line: patent protection, personal property rights, the ability to sell your invention. It's because of these protection of personal property rights and private property and our willingness to invest in the big problems and a governing system that allows the testing and marketing of new products that have brought millions of people out of poverty and allowed for higher standards of living not just in the U.S., but around the globe. A lot of those innovators are here in Houston, solving problems of zero emissions electricity through natural gas at Net Power, which I've talked about a lot. Curing childhood cancer at the Texas Medical Center, and of course our very own Rice University, which is really a standalone powerhouse in innovation. I think we can all agree American dominance in finding a cure for coronavirus is important. And the fact that we are dominating that search reminds us that we still are number one. We have 321 companies researching a novel vaccine or treatment for the virus. This is in contrast to the next closest country, China, which only has 39. The whole of Europe has just under 100. This hearing is important because we should be looking forward at the next set of challenges. We should be working as we work towards this. And I know there's a narrative out there that we're falling very far behind, but UN has us ranked number 3 in innovation index behind Switzerland and Sweden. The same report by the UN highlights something really important, that we need to push resources and global R&D towards biomedical innovation. Alzheimer's, ALS, cancer, diabetes, all of these are listed as crucial needs for innovation according to this innovation index by the UN. But let's remember, it's not just R&D spending that matters. That doesn't mean you're going to create the next big thing. There also has to be a free market, demand for it, and patent protection. Otherwise, we never get that next cure. Take, for example, Taiwan. It has very high R&D investment, number 8 in the world, actually. But their biotech market is extremely small. They produce very few new drugs, if any. Why? Price controls. So it's not a surprise that no one will take on risky investments if there's no payoff. Why would any life science company want to operate in Taiwan and sell to Taiwan when they have to deal with burdensome price control regulations? Okay, so my first question for Dr. Shea, with that in mind, what would be the impact on American medical innovation if we reverted to a Taiwanese model of drug pricing?
Well, Taiwan has been more successful in, other sectors than biomed. I've looked at some of the biomed things. I think the ability to recoup a return on investment to fund further R&D is very important, right? And that's why patent protection is very important. Now, when we talk about the pandemic, okay, we also have instances, for example, where you really have a global health problem, right, which I think was pointed out earlier, right? And those call for maybe, you almost have a market failure because the companies aren't incented to work on low-cost vaccines, for example, for poor regions, where in fact the poor regions, if you don't get infection under control, there is going to come back to us. But I do believe it is important to provide incentives. And by the way, part of the patent bargain, which is disclosed in the Constitution, is it only gives it to you for a limited period of time, right? Which is in exchange for making that R&D investment, then you get to reap the returns for some period. So I think it is important.
Absolutely. And we don't want to lose that. And I think that's the point of maintaining American innovation, because if we weren't a biomedical powerhouse, what country do you think would be next in line to provide the world with that next ALS cure, the next Alzheimer's cure, et cetera?
It would probably be the Europeans, right, who are investing very heavily in Germany, in Denmark. For example, I looked at one company in Denmark that provides 70% of the world's allergy immunotherapies, okay? And I visited the factory there that provides 50% of the world's insulin, okay? And so the Europeans are taking these long-term views. They are also, to the point that was raised earlier, funding collaborative pre-competitive research in many areas. You see this in batteries most recently, okay? And you see it in electrification and things like that.
Well, and I'm out of time. I went fast. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Womack. Good to hear about the investment at the University of Arkansas, not just in the new football coach, but in the research that's going on there, Pig Sooie. Let me also just comment, if I can, and echo the sentiments by Dr. Parikh and Professor Price, Congressmember Price, in regards to the new policy that has been put out about removing visas for students who are legally here studying at colleges that have chosen to go remote only, basically making that decision to protect the health and safety of their students, unfortunately, has led to a senseless decision by this administration to remove those students that contribute so much, not just to our educational systems, but ultimately to our economy and to the research and diversity of this great nation. So I appreciate those comments, and that's exactly why I'm leading a letter to the Honorable Chad Wolf, Acting Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, asking Director Wolf, Secretary Wolf, to revisit this decision and hopefully answer some significant questions as to why they would implement or try to implement such a divisive policy, especially now during this pandemic. So I hope other members take a look at that letter and sign on if interested. Obviously, being from the Central Coast of California, immigration is very important to us for a number of reasons. It contributes to our economy, our communities, and ultimately our culture. I wholeheartedly believe in that. As my good friend Dan Kildee knows well, I come from the salad bowl of the world. So we have a lot of agriculture here. We have a lot of specialty crops here. And we also know that in order to sustain those types of crops, But the most important thing, immigration is a big issue, but it's also research into those types of crops. And we are lucky to have the universities that we do here that do invest in that type of research. We also have a USDA agricultural research station that makes those sort of investments. But ultimately, what it comes down to is we need more federal funding for that. Now, I think historically, the United States has been on the forefront of agricultural research and innovation, but we're being outspent by our competitors. And now we're seeing a 40% return on investment. Despite that, the U.S. public sector funding for agriculture research is declining. And obviously, I'm concerned about those types of implications, those types of trends when it comes to our food security, as well as our food sustainability. Now, in Congress, I'm trying to do my part in more ways than one than to just talk about the salad bowl of the world, but making sure that we actually get other members involved. And Rodney Davis, a Republican, and myself have started the Ag Research Caucus to highlight the importance of federal investments in agricultural research. But if I can direct a couple questions to Dr. Parikh and Dr. Romer, can you comment on the decline in U.S. investments in ag research and the potential implications of this trend in both our domestic and global food security, as well as any sort of solutions, especially when it comes to partnering with private companies as well?
Thank you. Yes, the decrease over time is partly as a result of the success of the programs. The U.S. has become it is the breadbasket of the world, and our farmers have done a wonderful job of feeding the world. And a lot of that has come because of the work of the ARS and the USDA in transmitting the best information about how to make yields better, how to make crops better, and how to supply a product that the market wants. In terms of I actually think this is a perfect example of what Dr. Romer talks about. So I'll stop talking and let him talk because he's the expert in this. Of this move to useful research at a grand scale locally. Dr. Romer.
Yeah, the agricultural research was one of the real successes in the pre-World War II system in the United States. And it was research that was spread throughout the country, that was focused on practical benefits. It's very important to the future of the world because we have to keep raising productivity to keep up with growing population and growing demand for meat. So, and it is the kind of thing which frankly has been squeezed out because professors in the top universities want to work on the cutting edge issues like genomics, which was very important basic science, but the bread and butter of agricultural research is being neglected. And so when I call for a return to what worked before World War II, it's not to take away from the new things in basic research we do, but to go back to supporting those things. Let me just say there's also potential funding mechanisms that could guarantee this. The commodity producers can levy a tax on themselves to, for example, pay for ads, if you remember the dancing raisins and so forth. I think we should be looking for ways for agricultural groups to tax themselves so that they're the ones who are actually allocating the research dollars. And they can use those dollars both to get practical research done in universities throughout the country, but also to encourage students to get trained in the kinds of skills and habits of mind that will lead to productivity increase in agriculture.
Great. Thank you for those answers. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, again.
Absolutely. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes. Unmute your mic.
That's 2 times today I've done that. Sorry about that. I appreciate the testimony that we've had today, and I appreciate the value of the hearing. I've always referred to basic research as a seed corn for future economic growth and human opportunity. And in this regard, I appreciated Dr. Shee's opening comments where he said that government support of basic and applied research can fertilize the soil, but it takes private companies willing to make a long-term investment in risky R&D to build that, and that the role of the federal government should be to enable and support, not hinder the private sector to lead the way in restoring U.S. manufacturing capabilities and competitiveness. I represent 2 of the largest Tier 1 public research universities in the country. One of them, my alma mater, is the largest land-grant university in the United States, and it educates nearly 70,000 students annually, preparing them for cutting-edge jobs in Texas, the U.S., and actually all over the world. And with almost $340 million in annual research expenditures, Texas A&M University provides solutions to challenging national problems, ranging from hypersonics to vaccine development to vaccine manufacturing. And this research serves as a cornerstone to the regional economy, and it's critical to the future economic growth of this country. Like many sectors of the economy, research universities like Texas A&M have been hit hard by the impacts of COVID-19. And during the past few weeks, only essential research has continued on campus. And as a result of that, the university has experienced over $30 million of research losses. And worse than that, the cumulative impact of the delayed research is going to have a huge economic impact for the country. And so those numbers continue to grow. So given the importance of research for our present and future competitiveness, I support the bipartisan RISE Act, which includes additional resources to help offset those losses that are being experienced by the research institutions. I'd urge my colleagues to support the inclusion of these RISE Act provisions in the next relief package. I'd like to ask Ms. Wentz-Smith a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. The first one is, during the COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think are the most effective ways to assist universities with their vital research efforts? Do you think funding research shortfalls created by lab shutdowns like we envision in the RISE Act is a wise public investment?
Thank you, Congressman. Well, first of all, congratulations on the leadership and contribution of Texas A&M University. They're a very active member of the Council on Competitiveness and tremendous engineering and ag capability. They really are a star in our firmament of universities in the United States. I do think the RISE Act really is very important at this time, because if we allow the atrophying of a lot of these ongoing research activities, we will potentially lose the people. It's back to the people issue. And of course, it also links to the immigration challenge that we're facing right now that others have mentioned, in terms of ensuring the continuity of research, because the speed and scope of what we need to do across the board really cannot be interrupted without damaging, that infrastructure. So the RISE Act, I think, is a very important initiative for Congress to consider in the next phase of COVID relief. Having said that, I do think we're seeing tremendous innovation now coming out of universities in looking at their business models. And many universities are really still structured sort of on a 19th century model. And we've seen others that have moved very quickly to embrace lots of innovations in how they're delivering education involving young people in designing programs and things. So I would project that in the years ahead, our university system is going to look very different than it does right now. Having said that, we can't disrupt our research, and we need to make sure we have the talented people to keep that going.
If I could just weigh in here, there's a very important issue here. The way to get research going again in universities is to do what Stanford Medical Center did, which was test every person in the medical center who is patient-facing and to test patients as they come back in. So they reopened Stanford Medical Center, and it's operating just the way it did before. We could do this in every university if we use the testing resources that universities have available to them to test everybody and test everybody frequently, but to get back to the work on university campuses. And the bottleneck here is the CDC and the FDA, who are impeding our ability to do this kind of testing.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Yarmuth, I have one more question, but you'll probably shut me down, so I'll submit it for the record.
Oh, go ahead. Since Dr. Romer wanted to object to that, you go right ahead.
Okay, thank you for your forbearance. This question is also for Ms. Wentz-Smith. As you brought up the people resources, which are, of course, our most important resource. As the pandemic continues, universities like A&M have made a commitment to continue paying those researchers, including graduate students and principal investigators. And I applaud the effort that the universities are making to ensure that our research workforce pipeline continues. How can the federal government support the training and education of this future workforce during this challenging time?
Very, very important question. I would like to expand it, if I may, a little bit to look at parts of the country where we have, tremendous unemployment. We have tremendous hardship underway, including lots of social issues, and the extent to which the universities can link the big research universities with community colleges and some of the other workforce boards and training and pool their resources to ensure that we can continue the upskilling of our workforce. I know there are controversial issues around the HB1 visas and, the numbers of these and how this impacts U.S. jobs, etc. But at the same time, and I think my colleagues have said this as well, we need to have a balance between attracting, keeping, retaining the best and brightest around the world in this research enterprise, but double down on educating and training our own citizens, particularly women, minorities, underrepresented racial groups. And that is part of the equity of our democracy. And this is an opportunity to really focus on that right now.
I agree. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the forbearance. And Jimmy Panetta, I'd like to join your Ag Research Caucus, if that's okay. I yield back.
That gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you first, Mr. Chairman, for holding this, what I think is critically important hearing. And when I just finished, 26, 28 years in the state legislature in New York, represent Rochester, New York, which, we've spent a lot of time on innovation and technology as a way to revitalize what were old industrial cities. And I know, Dr. Romer, we miss you at the University of Rochester. I know you spent part of your career there, so we claim you as part of our own, but you know well the challenge that we face. In fact, I was just looking at, I've been reading Jumpstarting America, which you may be familiar with, all the panelists, written by John Gruber and Simon Johnson, who I had a chance to spend some time with, both on the phone and at dinner recently. It actually talks about innovation as federal investment and why this is important. Also just happens to rank Rochester, New York as #1 in the country if we make major investments. So we're very proud of that. But all of this is really premised on the notion that more than 85%, I believe, of our nation's economic growth since World War II. So now we're approaching, not 75 years, where all of our successes, or a substantial part of our success, has been attributed to scientific, technological research, innovation, and progress. It is alarming to me that when we talk about reducing that investment and reducing federal investment in those activities, I just want to, since I've bragged on about Rochester, I'm going to brag a little more if I can, and just use this as a case in point. Our district is lucky at the University of Rochester's Medical Center. We're part of the New York Influenza Center of Excellence, one of the 5 international centers in the Centers of Excellence in influenza research and surveillance network, and we are one of only 9 of the National Institutes of Health vaccine trials and evaluation units, particularly appropriate given where we are with the pandemic. But this has been made possible for the past 5 years because the U of R has attracted more than $1.93 billion in sponsored research funding to the region, and is a national leader in translating discoveries into new technology. We have a brand new clinical translational sciences cluster that we've created. We're doing this around technologies, applications, companies that treat and cure disease, improve national security, help our nation move towards sustainable clean energy. If we as a Congress continue to invest in federal research, institutions across our country, just like the University of Rochester, probably like Texas A&M, and all of the amazing universities we have in the United States, we can do so much more to harness innovation and discoveries into commercially viable technologies and companies. So I'm proud to say that many of our U of R scientists are working right now on conducting clinical trials of vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics for COVID-19. But I do want to, and I apologize for the long intro, but I did want to ask Dr. Romer, what specific policies or general thoughts do you have about approaches that we should consider to help ensure that the immense scientific understanding and capacity of the United States is actually transitioned into use into the broader economy and its society at large? How do we make that transition? What should we be doing as a Congress and as a country to help their transition?
I think there are two things. One is invest in people and then try and be the place where people want to stay and work. That means we can keep attracting well-trained people from the rest of the world, but we're really under-investing in our own U.S. talent. And this is why I think fellowship programs and an attempt to redo what we did with like electrical engineering, chemical engineering could be so important now. So invest in people and use all of our universities to carry out that mission. The second is, I talked about having agricultural producers influence what happens on university campuses. I think in Rochester, you see a good example of this in optics, where Kodak and then Bausch and Lomb encouraged work on particular questions and then encouraged training of students on questions related to optics, which turned out to be very important for lasers and a number of other kinds of applications.
Direct assistance and
I couldn't agree more. I will say this, that we have in the state and the federal government have both created a big optics and imaging manufacturing institute. The United States invested, the state of New York has invested, we invested $250 million on optics and photonics. Exactly what you're saying is to make that investment. And photonics, photons move faster than electrons.
And I guess the way to say what I'm saying is that professors are a huge asset, a huge resource, but we need some other voices that are contributing to the decisions about where universities go. And if we gave fellowships, we could empower students to have a little bit more say. And if we put industry groups in a position to spend their own money on either research or training, that would bring their voices to the table too.
Oh, very good. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for another great hearing. Appreciate it.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a very interesting hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Baric. You mentioned the value in getting and a need for data in order to make informed decisions in the criminal justice area. There's Deaths in Custody Reporting Act requires the Department of Justice to collect data on deaths that occur in jails, prisons, and in the process of arrest, but the administration has not followed the law and hadn't collected the data. If they had followed the law or would begin to follow the law, the information would be collected would be demographic information and a brief narrative of what happened. If you collected that on deaths in custody all over the country, how could you use that data to make informed decisions in the criminal justice area?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Scott. It's challenging. We have social scientists who are very interested in looking at this data, analyzing this data, and providing prescriptions. Sometimes you don't know what those prescriptions are going to be until you've seen the data and are able to analyze it. So I wouldn't want to presuppose that, and I'm a biochemist, so I want to represent my social scientists well. But what I will say is that they feel very strongly that with access to data, they can provide prescriptions for national policy, and at least informed policy. And transparency leads to that ability to analyze the data. And so they would argue very strongly that we need to have transparency of demographics, of data related to violence, of data related to incarceration. These are all points of question that my social scientist stakeholders within the AAAS would say are very important, and frankly could do a great deal towards working to make the world a fairer place.
Well, thank you. I have one other question I just posed to all of the witnesses. Dr. Shi mentioned that the basic research is done by government, and then when you get the proof of concept, the corporations come and when profits around the corner, they can be counted on doing the rest of the research. The way we fund research is a number of different ways. R&D tax credits where the corporations get to decide what they want to do, direct cash if you have something you want to research, or direct investments in NASA, energy labs, NIH, and things like that. how could you get better coordination? Wouldn't you get better coordination with the investments in NASA, NIH, Energy Labs? And wouldn't it be better coordination and more bang for the buck if that's where you put your federal dollars on research rather than let corporations go wherever they want to go? And they probably would have done it anyway.
Well, let me suggest something. I think it's a very interesting question. I think we're actually at the threshold of an opportunity, okay, because I think it's historically been the federal government's role to fund basic R&D, but the government can also, especially in this pandemic recovery phase, when we're going to be spending a lot on infrastructure, I think we can also create demand, right? So there'll be push on the supply and pull from the demand, which would cause people to invest in particular areas, right? So, I mean, we're seeing a microcosm of that right now with vaccines and therapies for COVID-19, okay? But I think there are other areas, for example, where if we want to spend on infrastructure, I'm a big fan of grid modernization, right? Especially if you're from California, you know how obsolete our grid is, how vulnerable it is to disruption, okay? But if there were investments, infrastructure investments and grid modernization, it would drive a whole bunch of R&D, for example, in silicon carbide power devices, right? Energy storage technologies, group 3-5 semiconductors, and a whole bunch of other areas, right? So I think taking a more holistic and I would say strategic view on that, we really have an opportunity coming out of this crisis to do that.
Can I get Dr. Romer to comment very briefly on that question?
I think it's important to remember that we get huge benefits from a decentralized system that can focus on different issues. For example, at the University of Minnesota, they developed a technology for pelletizing iron ore, which was crucial for exploiting its iron ore reserves. And it's turned out to be very important in many other areas. A nationally controlled centralized system might not have focused on pelletization, but the local forces in Minnesota encouraged that kind of research. So
that was federal funding, I would imagine, federal or state funding.
It was really the federal government's support for the land grant institutions. So the federal government provided the background resources, but the actual decisions about the spending and the research to pursue were made locally. So I think we should be open to a system that allows a lot more decentralized decision-making on the specific research projects that are pursued.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The point I was making, if you spend a lot of money on R&D, the corporations get to do it. If you do things like fund the research universities, fund NASA, fund Energy Labs, fund NIH, it gets decentralized, but I think you get a much better bang for your buck. By the time the corporations get around, the basic research is done, profits around the corner, and they probably would have done most of that anyway. So thank you. Appreciate your indulgence.
Well, it's the other man with a gavel on the committee. No problem. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the witnesses as well. I'm glad to join this budget committee that is focusing on the necessity of research so we can save lives. Let me read into the record, first of all, the number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the United States, which is now a little bit over 3 million cases. Confirmed cases in Harris County, 39,311. Deaths, 395. Confirmed cases in Houston, 55,122. Deaths at 581. Those numbers have gone up from the moment that the state decided as of May 1st to end the stay-at-home order and, of course, to begin to open up the state. Business and the economy are very important, but it is extremely important to remember that R&D is a preventative measure that provides the opportunity to be prepared. And one of the issues in fighting COVID-19 is a question of preparation. So I'd like to ask Dr. Parikh, specifically R&D as it relates to where we are today. The idea of working with huge pharmaceuticals, which obviously exist. AstraZeneca received $1 billion to engage in vaccine research. A small company like Greffex, Greffex Incorporated, and some of the clinical trials that are going on here in Houston have had to struggle to get the attention of the federal government. What would have been the results of a proactive research R&D protocol for the United States, where we were engaged with research dealing with infectious diseases or the potential of diseases that really we've seen around the world? Dr. Parikh?
Thank you. I think what we're seeing is sort of a reflection of the investments that we have made over time. We have made a lot of investment in the basic research and in biomedical research. And so when the virus was isolated, the fact that within 3 months we had characterized the atomic structure of the coat protein and we had all the necessary information for starting vaccine trials is amazing. It's absolutely breathtaking. And that's the result of all the research and investment that has been made over the last 20 years in NIH, in that infrastructure. But then you also see the lack of investment in public health. You see the atrophy that's taken place in our public health departments around the country. You see some of the atrophy that's taken place at CDC. And so you don't see what you didn't get was the immediate public health response and the powerful public health response that could have helped us in the initial stages of the pandemic. We are. I think we should be very careful in terms of how we're guiding the science. So there's this research project that was looking at bat coronaviruses that had some field work in China, and that work was canceled by the administration. And one of the things that I really worry about is scientific integrity. And there are lots of reasons, and administrations are within their rights to cancel research projects, but they shouldn't make the scientist the instrument of that cancellation.
Thank you very much. My time is short. Let me proceed, and thank you very much for your answer to Deborah Wynn-Smith, the Honorable Deborah Wynn-Smith, on my specific point about the value of competitiveness in the United States and the importance of building a body politic of small researchers to be able to engage in competitiveness. And as I indicated, there are clinical trials going on here in Houston, Texas, dealing with COVID-19 that are not able to pierce the structure in the federal government, and therefore their research is languishing. I think the comments of Dr. Parikh were important about the infrastructure of public health, but it also is important that we do follow the science, but that we also have the R&D structure, the funding for R&D, that we promote all of this research that's going on in the United States that may not be the size of AstraZeneca. Would you respond?
Well, one thing I think is a very interesting model is how some states, and this is a leadership issue, but some of the leading universities are coming together and forming their own consortiums to identify within their own respective research environments potential innovation and pulling their assets together to both identify and help that. So we know, universities have special funds for startups. Some of them have actually venture capability, but doing that at a state level more collaboratively, and also leveraging with state resources the SBIR grant, stage 1 and 2, to get a critical mass is one path. Because I think you're completely right. I hear every day about, somebody has the answer to testing. How do we get to the FDA, for approval? And so I do think that, yes, there's the federal level. The White House Science Office really should be playing a role coordinating some of this. But it would be very exciting to see how some of the states themselves and the universities within the states could pool their resources to help on identifying and promoting these startup capabilities coming out of their assets. And the other thing I think I'll mention is, we've talked a lot about demand and the mission focus, but certainly, this is now a national mission to ensure that we have the preparedness, we have the anticipatory R&D investment. So the next time we have a pandemic, and there will be one, we can respond in a resilient, adaptive way and not be scurrying around the way we've had to do this time, really for a lack of organization, I think, not capability.
No doubt we should leave out the small competitors who have possibly a potential for vaccine, for cure, or for good research.
We should make sure they're part of the solution. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now yield myself 10 minutes. Let me, at the outset, thank all the witnesses for your responses, your testimony, and your candor. It's been an honor to have you as part of the hearing. When I became chairman of the committee, one of the things that I decided in a way we could reimagine the committee was to talk about different subjects and how they will impact the budget either presently or going forward. So we've had hearings on immigration policy and climate change. Ms. Wynn-Smith, I know you talked about artificial intelligence. We're going to have a hearing on artificial intelligence and how that might impact the budget. So the focus has always been there are other committees of jurisdiction for these subjects and these issues, but they all have budgetary implications, and that's what we're doing today. So I think where I would like to start is in talking about R&D. We talk about its impact on so many things, but what is the potential impact on the budget going forward, and whether it's through employment, whether it's through developing new industries and so forth, and what would be the budgetary implications of a reduced or even more of a maintenance level of investment in R&D. And I'll start with our Nobel Prize-winning economist, Dr. Romer.
So I think the investments the United States has made in its university system, in its primary and secondary education system from the very beginning, those investments in institutions that raise our skill, that produce human capital, these have been the highest return investments that we've ever made. And I think if we continue to make those, we could have more growth in the future, and we would have more income, more tax revenue, and we would get the benefits of a self-fulfilling reinforcing cycle. So I think we can't underestimate the importance of investing in people. Research is one of the ways to invest in people, but it's not the only way. And I think we should really look very carefully at the National Defense Education Act from the 50s and the kind of indirect support the feds provided for education throughout the nation. And in closing, let me just reinforce this point that it's wonderful to be able to draw on talent from all over the world. It's wonderful to encourage the flows of ideas throughout the world, but there's something wrong that we can persuade so few of our citizens when they're in school to continue on in graduate school. And we can fix that, I think, by giving the students more control, not making them like serfs working for professors, but empowering them to pursue a career that is exciting to them. We will actually we can supplement the international supply of talent with a much deeper, much better educated U.S. body of talent.
Ms. Wynn-Smith, this is one of the emphases of the Council on Competitiveness. How would you respond to that question? What is our potential downfall if we don't do enough, and what is the potential upside?
Well, I very much agree with what Dr. Romer said, so I will give a little different answer in that we really are living right now in a very low productivity era. And in order to jumpstart our productivity, which really is essential in order to increase the standard of living for all our citizens, we have to really invest in what are going to be the drivers of next generation productivity. And it really is going to come from not just the research and development investments at universities and labs, but how we commercialize at scale all of these capabilities to drive the new industries, products, and services of the future that create value and jobs, that are high paying for all of our citizens. So if we don't invest in the people and we don't invest in these big platform opportunities, and we know they're there, we don't have to identify them, we will be left behind economically. We will lose global influence. We will not be able to invest and contribute to global grand challenges in food, energy, water, climate. And our national security will be very, very weakened. And I think today the two come together. You can no longer divide the impact of our economic success from our national security needs as well. So we have to invest in the people, the platform capabilities, and the infrastructure to deliver it.
Dr. Parikh, I'd like to address that also, but let me add one question to you. In your testimony, when you were talking about the model needing to be adjusted, the Vannevar-Bush model needing to be adjusted, you mentioned that the federal government should assume a quarterback's role. If you could explain what that means.
Yeah, it's not a perfect analogy, but the federal government is the largest single contributor to that ecosystem, and the federal government can contribute in ways that Vannevar-Bush never even imagined, right? Because there are many models for funding. Dr. Romer has talked about the need to make sure that our land grant universities are strong. There are so many different ways. You can fund investigators directly. You can fund ideas. You can fund students. We have to have that approach of creating an ecosystem, many different paths to success, because those paths are now what is driving everything. He never imagined that we would be collaborating with that the pharmaceutical industry would be a global industry where research that was happening here was going to be complementary to what's happening in Europe. We have to make sure that this new model takes all that into account and then is really a broad spectrum support by the federal government. But then some of the platforms that we spoke about earlier, the federal government can identify those and point us in those directions. That's not so that there's nothing outside of that, but certainly coordinating roles for infectious disease, coordinating roles for artificial intelligence. We know that these are going to be important platforms. We have to make sure we're investing in them.
Dr. Shi, you want to respond to that question?
Well, so let me respond to the original question. And, I agree with what Dr. Romer and others have said so far. Okay, one of the other things I want to highlight is that, our investments have been made over many decades, and they've been substantial, right? And they will carry us for some time if we fail to invest enough, but it will decline. We've already seen that in some industries, okay, and it has a long tail, okay? And then rebuilding that is going to be much more expensive, okay? So we just have to recognize that time lag as well. We're already in the decline in many areas where we can't do those things in the U.S. anymore. All you have to do is look at the source of publications in many fields, and you see it has already shifted to Asia, okay? So it's a long-term investment, okay? It's beyond one election cycle for sure, right? But, we need to think in terms of decade-type goals, right? I mean, when I was growing up, I used to make fun of China's 5-year plans, right? Because, Mao Zedong, well, we're going to do deep tilling, and he causes a famine in China, okay? But one thing the Chinese have done well is this kind of long-term planning, okay? And they learn from their mistakes as well, right? And so I've become less critical of that. It's like it would be nice to have kind of that longer-term vision, especially when it comes towards capability building and people development. And I come back to the capabilities are embodied in people. The people are everything, right? And so our university system has been tremendous in feeding that pipeline. one other thing I'll add is like, you don't think anybody in China who has, seen what's in the U.S. and see the opportunities available wouldn't rather live here? They have a chance. Okay. And so we continue to be the place that is the most attractive destination in the world. Let's not screw that up.
I appreciate that. And getting to the issue of personnel and talent and so forth, this really is a long-term project because we need to start figuring out how to get young people attracted to the field, because you can't just say to somebody who's a senior in high school or a junior in college, okay, go into research. It has to start much younger than that. And one of the things that I'm going to go over my own time, but again, I have the gavel, is that I think about what we saw in the movie Hidden Figures and the black women who had done extraordinary things, but who nobody in the country knew anything about. And I'm sure young black children didn't know anything about that. Years ago, when I was writing columns, I was doing a Black History column, and I was doing some research, and I found out, I'm an avid golfer, I found out that the golf tee was invented by a black dentist, G.W. Grant. Who would have ever thought that? And then you think about George Washington Carver and so many instances, Lewis Latimer, who invented the filament. And so a lot of it is exposing young people to role models, I would think, as to what their potential is as well. Anybody want to comment on that briefly?
Yeah, Chairman Yarmouth, if I could, the AAAS is a gatekeeper organization, right? If you publish in Science Magazine, you're on your way to an academic career and a research career. You're well on your way. If you get a fellowship from us, you're well on your way. And one of the things that we notice is representation matters, right? So if in our fellowship process, there's a very good demographic diversity in the selection committee, and lo and behold, the awardees are diverse. When you look at our editors of our journal, it's not as diverse. And you see that the publications are not as diverse. There is something very important about representation and mentorship that we have to make sure that we are not letting this moment hurt. And I'll just speak to this moment for a second. With COVID-19, the disruptions to research, with these immigration policies, and then challenges to our K-12 educational system, we're in danger of losing a generation of talent in the sciences. And that would be tragic, because these are lagging indicators. We're living on the investments that were made in people 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
If I could just echo something that Deborah Wynn Smith said, she pointed to the military academies. The United States government, through the military, has done a very good job on many issues about inclusion and diversity. And they show that if you commit to the principle that everybody can participate and contribute, and you live by that standard, you can make that happen. So I think they should be a model for how the government requires all of our other institutions to do as well as we've done in the military.
Could I just add one thing? I would just like that one example of a university that has done an incredible job in bringing women and underrepresented minorities into STEM from the graduate level all the way up through being graduate students, and that's the University of California at Santa Barbara. They have a completely different model. The moment these young people are freshmen, they are linked with advanced researchers doing PhD work, and they get inspired, and they are mentored all the way through. It's not the traditional thing of, you come into a big chemistry class, and by the end of the year, 3/4 of you are weeded out. We have to expand the pool of innovators in the United States. And again, that doesn't mean that we don't bring others in. And the council was the first organization that said staple a green card, for the graduates in our science and engineering enterprise. But we have to bring in our own citizens as part of the enterprise.
Well, I'll let that be the last word. Once again, thank you all for your time and your wisdom, and we appreciate it very much. I think we've made quite a record here in this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Flores. I guess you're sitting in as ranking member. Again, I appreciate you bearing with us. And with that, if there's no further business, this hearing is adjourned.